So, it's been 1 year since The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild released worldwide, and a few months since its final pack of DLC. With such a huge game and a monumental change to the typical Zelda formula, those weeks and even months leading up to its debut felt like forever. Zelda was once again at the forefront of Nintendo, and everyone was talking about it. The game went on to be one of the best-selling Zelda titles to date, being only the second Zelda game to sell over 1 million copies in Japan, and it won countless Game of the Year awards from various different outlets. 365 days later, what do you say we take another look at Breath of the Wild, examine what it did right, what it did wrong, what we can learn from it, and lastly, where is the Legend of Zelda series going next? While most people would refer to Breath of the Wild as an open world game, Nintendo themselves used the term open air to describe Breath of the Wild's overworld, and while the two may sound similar, the differences are what make Zelda unique. When asked by IGN, Miyamoto gave this as the reasoning behind the terminology. We want to use the technology and the techniques that are available to make what we want to make. What's important is to really express how we use that to make our experiences unique. We didn't want to just make a game where you can do anything, but we wanted to make sure that we make a game where the player is able to do anything, but it's also a form of entertainment. It's fun to do all those things. And that last bit is the important part, making a game where you can do anything, but doing so is one of the main ways the game entertains you. You see, personally, I find Breath of the Wild's world to be one of the more interesting things about it. Not so much the forest, desert, or snow-covered mountains, but how the world itself operates. Breath of the Wild employs a simple, yet very robust set of rules. During development, Nintendo called this the chemistry engine, and unlike boring high school chemistry, the chemistry engine in Breath of the Wild is wonderful. To really appreciate it though, you need to understand how it works. You see, Nintendo put in place a certain rule set in the world and made it as consistent as possible while also keeping things simple. For instance, you can use fire to burn down wooden objects, make a camp to pass time, create updrafts, or keep yourself warm in the tundra. When it rains, the surface of the world becomes wet and slippery, and for better or worse, this limits your mobility by making it much harder to climb objects. On top of that, if it's a lightning storm, lightning will be attracted to metallic objects like your weapons or shields. This means that you'll have to switch gear to stay safe, but it also means you can use these objects in other creative ways that may or may not be intended, like using metallic objects as weapons, or using your swords and shields to open a gate with electricity. While those might not be ideal solutions, they work because of the rules that Nintendo set in place. Now obviously those are only a few examples, but the potential is seemingly limitless, and it lets each player experience the game differently and leads to moments that you remember and want to share with other Zelda enthusiasts. It's hands down my favorite part of the game. Best of all, the game teaches you all of the foundations fairly early on in the quote-unquote tutorial section that is the Great Plateau, which I could probably make an entire video about in itself, but just know for now, I believe the Great Plateau is one of the best opening segments to any open world game ever. It perfectly teaches you as the player just enough to prepare you for what's ahead, without being too intrusive and stopping you from doing things at your own pace or in your own way. The overworld is only half of the game though. The rest comes from a combination of shrines, divine beasts, and Hyrule Castle. So let's start with the shrines. Shrines are smaller, more condensed puzzles that often take a simple concept, expand upon it, until eventually reaching a conclusion of that idea, and then throwing it away to never really be seen again. There are of course a few exceptions and similarities between shrines, as well as the simple combat shrines that test your strength, and blessing shrines that just reward you after solving a puzzle in the overworld. But besides those examples, each shrine is at least somewhat original. It's such a departure from traditional Zelda that I can't help but feel a little disappointed in the shrines. Not because they're bad, but because I wish they were longer. I wish they offered more. There are only a handful of shrines that twist and turn and wrap around on itself and feel like an actual dungeon, and even fewer have things that used to be staples in The Legend of Zelda like small keys. As a result, towards the end of the game, completing shrines felt less rewarding and more like a chore to complete that last row of hearts or fill up your stamina meter. And sadly, this sentiment continues into the game's main dungeons, the Divine Beasts. Before entering the Divine Beasts, Link must embark on some story-related quest that will eventually lead him into a cinematic approach section in which he must disable the beast before he can climb aboard. I found these moments to be a lot of fun. Well, all but one of them. I'm sorry, but the escort mission with Yunobo up Death Mountain is one of the worst parts of the game in my opinion. It's slow, tedious, and just not fun at all. Everything else was great though. Riding on the back of Sidon, flying through the air above Tabantha, and surfing the sand dunes while dodging lightning were not only memorable, but overall just great moments in the game. Once you get inside, however, you are greeted with a rather boring aesthetic of browns and emptiness. Each dungeon consists of Link locating a map and then activating 5 terminals before taking on a boss. The entire area is open and you can locate these terminals in whichever order you see fit, but long gone are the days of navigating through and getting lost in temples searching for that missing small key. On top of that, because every Divine Beast shares a similar aesthetic, they all sort of blend together and create a slight disconnect from the rest of the game. If anything, the Divine Beasts made me appreciate the design and layouts of previous Zelda dungeons even more so than I already did. There is something to be said about walking into a temple and not knowing what to expect, and sadly, Breath of the Wild's Divine Beasts offer little in that regard. That's not to say it's all bad. One thing I like about the Divine Beast is the ability to manipulate them in real time to solve puzzles. Moving the trunk in Vah Ruta not only allows Link to reach the top of the beast, but you can also use water to change the direction of a giant water wheel or put out flames. Tilting Vah Meadow to either side allows Link to reach different areas and activate switches. Vah Naboris features a central set of circuitry that you can rotate around to send electricity to different parts of the beast. And lastly, Vah Rudania can rotate onto its side to completely change how Link moves around on the inside and out. Overall, these mechanics are great, and because they happen in real time and not in a cutscene, the player is in direct control and can instantly see how each change affects the dungeon. It makes for a much smoother interaction, and I would have loved to see this used a lot more, perhaps even with the ability to control several different elements within the same Divine Beast, which would add to the overall complexity and create some very interesting puzzles. Lastly, there's Hyrule Castle. Hyrule Castle is actually one of my favorite areas in the game. Its design rewards clever players with multiple routes that can be taken on foot, but it also gives an extra bonus to players who went out of their way to pick up certain gear or learn special abilities. Completed Vah Meadow? Well, I suppose you can just use Revali's Gale to reach the top almost instantly. Picked up the Zora tunic from Zora's Domain? Feel free to swim up these waterfalls for a quick trip upwards. It's moments like this where you can see the benefits in Nintendo's design philosophy of letting the player do whatever they want shine through. Having all these different options and possibilities lets the player experiment and discover new things on their own that otherwise might not have been possible with a more linear approach to game design. Not only that, but Hyrule Castle is filled with secrets and interesting things to do. Hidden diaries that enhance and expand upon the game's story and lore, weapon caches that allow you to stock up with highly valuable gear before the final fight, and other just interesting sights to see. If you haven't taken the time to fully explore Hyrule Castle, I would implore you to do just that. The level of detail and amount of things to find is a glimpse at how much better this game could have been had Nintendo taken the same level of care with the rest of the game's world. Overall, you can really tell Hyrule Castle had a ton of thought put into it, and that's why I really have nothing bad to say about it. We've already talked about the rules of Nintendo's open-air world, but now let's actually dive headfirst into the overworld itself. Breath of the Wild boasts a massive overworld, and it truly is amazing just how large of a map they were able to squeeze into this game. But I can't help but feel a lot of it is just empty and uninteresting. Sure, you have the occasional town, stable, NPC, or ruins of a forgotten village, but those are few and far in between. A lot of the overworld is just green grass and trees. And I know you're probably saying, but Matt, what about all the Korok seeds in the shrines? And yeah, the game does have 120 shrines littered all over the world and 900 Korok seeds to find, but my problem with this is, these are all optional tasks. You don't need to track down every shrine, and you certainly don't need to collect all 900 Korok seeds. While yes, I can agree these elements encourage you to explore every square inch of the overworld, my issue is with the payoff. Completing every shrine allows you to max out your stamina or your hearts. Not both, mind you, just one or the other, which besides triggering my OCD, leaves me feeling like something is missing. And after the first 440-ish Korok seeds, Link can no longer expand his inventory, making the rest entirely pointless. Especially seeing as how the reward for collecting all 900 is actually a giant Korok turd that has absolutely zero use in the game. If you were to look at Breath of the Wild's map and ignore the regions that don't have any story-related content in them, you could cut out a total of 3 regions. That's roughly 25% of the game's map. And honestly, I think it would still be fine. I would much rather have a smaller world that is more densely populated with more interesting things to see and do than one that just feels a little too big for its own good.
Hero of Hyrule, chosen by the sword that seals the darkness.
And now let's try to tackle the narrative of Breath of the Wild. Link, of course, wakes up in the Chamber of Resurrection after being dealt a fatal blow 100 years ago. His goal is to, of course, travel to Hyrule Castle and save Princess Zelda by defeating Calamity Ganon. Along the way, you have the option of trying to recover your missing memories and take back control of each of the 4 divine beasts. In theory, this is all well and good, but there's a disconnect between the events that happen in Link's memory and what's actually going on in the game. Because so much time has already passed, any sense of urgency is completely gone. To me, the story feels fragmented and incomplete, like it tries to rope you in and make you feel for these characters, but those moments are very spread out, and unless you're actively doing story segments, it's quite easy to forget about them as you're going about your adventure. I struggle to really criticize Breath of the Wild storytelling because balancing a compelling story and strong narrative while also having your game as open as Breath of the Wild is surely isn't an easy task. But that being said, in the future, I hope Nintendo can figure out a way to incorporate a much stronger story into the next installment of The Legend of Zelda, because I think for a lot of people, the lore and stories of The Legend of Zelda are equally as important as the gameplay. Musically, Breath of the Wild features some fantastic tracks, the Hyrule Castle medley being a fan favorite, but some other noteworthy tracks would be the town themes from Rito Village, Tarrey Town, and Gerudo Town. Otherwise, the music in Breath of the Wild is very subdued. What's there is good, but you don't often get a chance to listen to it. Instead, you'll hear a lot of ambient noises or the shorter occasional string of notes that play as you adventure through Hyrule. While I understand that this fits with the theme of the game, and Breath of the Wild is no stranger to breaking the conventions of past Zelda games, it feels slightly lackluster. The music in Zelda games has always been a highlight for me, and I simply would have loved to hear more of it in Breath of the Wild. Lastly, let's talk about the DLC. Breath of the Wild has been fortunate enough to receive 2 DLC packs during its lifespan, the first being Hero Mode and the Trial of the Sword. Hero Mode is just a slight up in the difficulty. Enemies will all be 1 stage stronger, and there is now a golden tier which is tougher than anything else that you faced up to that point. On top of that, if you stop attacking these enemies, they will steadily regain HP over time. In theory, this makes the game much harder, but in practice, anyone who is seasoned with Breath of the Wild's mechanics and combat shouldn't struggle too much here. The Trial of the Sword is a bit different, however. It's split up into 3 different stages, and I'll call these difficulty levels easy, medium, and hard. Upon completing each difficulty level, Link will be able to power up the Master Sword by 10 more damage points for a total of 60 once all levels are completed. These trials start you with nothing, and it's up to you to farm materials, food, weapons, and armor in order to survive the enemy gauntlets in each room. I really did enjoy the Trial of the Sword. Although it did get a bit repetitive towards the end, it provided a nice challenge, and overall the DLC took me about 3 hours to complete. Not bad, but DLC Pack 1 was really only created to buy time for DLC Pack 2. Pack 2 contained much more. Extra story content, more shrines, a new trial, and a brand new Divine Beast. DLC Pack 2 contains some of my favorite moments in Breath of the Wild. A new trial has Link utilizing a brand new weapon called the One-Hit Obliterator. A weapon so strong it can dispatch any enemy in a single blow. The catch is that in order to use this weapon's power, Link must give up all but 1/4 of his hearts, meaning that he himself is also subject to being killed in a single strike. You must carefully sneak around the Great Plateau and complete 4 shrines while in this deadly yet vulnerable state. Upon completion, the next stage starts, where you will travel to 4 different locations, find 3 more hidden shrines, which locations are revealed to you in a song, after which you will use the emblems granted to you to re-enter the Divine Beast and once again challenge the boss. This time, however, you are only equipped with what the champions had when they originally failed to defeat these blight creatures 100 years prior. This all eventually culminates with you returning to the Shrine of Resurrection and descending into the final Divine Beast. This Divine Beast is perhaps the best in the game. Its layout, puzzles, and mechanical theme are unforgettable, and it really demonstrates just how much more Nintendo could have done with the original 4 if perhaps they spent more time on them. Once all of that is complete, you are thrust directly into one of the best and perhaps most challenging bosses in the entire game. Maz Koshia is the monk that lived inside this Divine Beast, and defeating him proves Link is worthy and he's granted the use of the Master Cycle, a motorized steed that Link can call upon wherever he wants in Hyrule. Functionally, it's not that much different than a horse, but its speed and ability to be called instantly via the Sheikah Slate is more than enough to make it one of the coolest abilities in the game. I've really got nothing bad to say about DLC Pack 2. It added about 7 to 8 hours of gameplay, provided more story context, and had amazing moments through and through. I can't really criticize anything here, but I wanted to mention all of this because of how great it was, and I hope and expect this level of DLC quality going forward from Nintendo, especially when it comes to The Legend of Zelda. Overall, I think Breath of the Wild is the logical step for the Zelda series. It's good, and I enjoyed it, but I think the best way I can describe it is like this. Breath of the Wild is a first-generation implementation of an idea. Just like the first iPhone, the potential is there, but its execution was a little disappointing. If Breath of the Wild is the Zelda game we need to build a foundation for a new Zelda formula, then I think the Zelda series is going to do just fine in its upcoming years, and I'm even more excited for its next console installment. Anyway, I think I've gone on for long enough. I know I didn't touch on things like combat changes or the fact that runes replace some of Link's staple items, but to be honest, those are all welcome changes for me, and I don't have strong opinions on them either way. That being said, if you enjoyed this video, kindly slap a like on it, and if you want to hear more of my opinions on these things called video games, hit that subscribe button. Either way, once again guys, my name is Matt, thank you so much for watching, and I'll catch you in the next one.